Hello, welcome to my channel. In this video, we will focus on the effects and realities of money and debt throughout history and how they influence relationships between countries. Almost every country in the world is in debt. The United States alone currently owes more than $45 trillion, which is one of the highest levels in its history. The European Union is estimated to have around $17 trillion, while Japan is believed to have nearly $12 trillion in debt. Even oil-rich countries like Saudi Arabia, and export powerhouses such as Germany and China, are known to carry significant levels of debt. But from all of this, one question emerges. If everyone has debt, then who exactly are we indebted to? At this point, money, power, and history begin to intertwine. And if you look a little more carefully, you start to notice something important. In the global financial system, nothing is as simple as it seems. Because debt is not just a burden. It is, in a very real sense, one of the fundamental building blocks of the modern world. Every war, every economic crisis, every rise and every collapse has been built on top of this invisible financial structure. And if you follow the chain of creditors long enough, you eventually come face to face with a deeply unsettling truth. The global order is not actually indebted to a single individual or institution. In a general sense, the world is indebted to itself. But that does not mean that everyone benefits equally from this system. Today, the world's total estimated debt exceeds $350 trillion, nearly 3 times the size of the global economy. This did not happen by coincidence. To understand how it began, we need to go back several centuries. Long before credit cards, digital payments, or online banking, the idea of international debt emerged in a much simpler place. War. In 1694, England was at war with France, and its gold reserves were running out. The king needed money to continue the war, so he reached an agreement with wealthy merchants. The deal was quite simple. Merchants would provide financing to the state, and in return the government would promise to pay continuous interest, funded by taxes collected in the future. To manage this system, the Bank of England was established, and this became one of the biggest turning points in history. For the first time, a state could spend money it did not yet possess. In return, lenders received something extremely valuable: a strong government promise that could be bought and sold. This marked the birth of the government bond, which later became the main seed of the modern financial system. Soon, other countries adopted the same system. France implemented it, the Dutch significantly improved it, and the newly established United States used this method to finance its revolution and its westward expansion. Over time, something unusual happened. National debt was no longer seen as a sign of weakness. On the contrary, it became a symbol of credibility. If a country could easily borrow money, it meant that it was trusted. And trust meant power. In earlier centuries, empires conquered land to obtain gold. Today, they issue bonds to generate interest. Battlefields gradually transformed into balance sheets. 300 years later, we see that debt has become one of the most powerful layers of the global economy. The United States has $45 trillion in debt. Japan has more than $12 trillion. Global debt increases by $1 trillion roughly every 120 days. All countries borrow. All banks lend. And every citizen, through taxes, savings, and pension funds, is in reality both a debtor and a creditor. Which brings us back to the same question. Who really holds the other end of the rope? Let us first look at the United States. Because America's debt is not just a national issue, but also a global one. Of the nearly $45 trillion in debt, close to half is held by investors outside government institutions. But many of these investors are actually American institutions themselves. Banks, pension funds, insurance companies, investment funds, and even the Federal Reserve. The portion held by foreign countries is around $10 trillion. At the top of that list is Japan, with about $1.5 trillion. It is followed by China, with around $850 billion. Then come countries such as the United Kingdom, Luxembourg, and Belgium. So when people say that America owes China money, it is not entirely wrong. But it represents only about 3% of the total debt. Most of America's debt is actually owned by America itself. The government issues bonds. Financial institutions buy those bonds. Sometimes the Federal Reserve buys them back and creates new money in return. Americans pay taxes, and those taxes finance the interest on these bonds. That money often flows back into American pension funds. In a sense, the system works like a mirror-like cycle. The debt is real, but the creditor is usually another part of the same system. And this cycle is not unique to the United States. It is a global structure. Japan lends money to the United States. The United States provides loans to Europe through the IMF. Europe lends money to developing countries through the World Bank. Those countries then invest their foreign currency reserves in Western government bonds, effectively lending back to developed economies. In reality, the whole world is playing a massive financial, hot potato, game. Except the potato is made of promises. Every country holds another country's debt. Every promise is supported by another promise. It resembles a giant poker table where everyone is borrowing chips from one another. And there is only one rule that keeps the game alive. No one stands up from the table. But there is another layer to this system. Perhaps the most powerful one. Financial markets. Behind every government bond stands a vast network of institutions. Hedge funds, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and central banks. These institutions manage trillions of dollars, and they act as the real referees of the system. They decide which countries can borrow cheaply and which ones must pay extremely high interest. When their trust disappears, currencies collapse, governments fall, and economies can change overnight. Democracy determines who governs countries. But markets often determine who survives. And at the center of this entire system stands a very powerful actor: central banks. Central banks do not only manage debt. In a sense, they create it. When the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank buys government bonds, they create new money to complete the transaction. What appears as a liability on one balance sheet becomes an asset on another. And this leads us to an important truth. Every unit of money in circulation represents debt somewhere. There is no such thing as money completely independent from debt. Every coin, every banknote, and every digital currency essentially carries an invisible promise. This system has survived for centuries because of one thing: trust. As long as investors believe that governments will continue paying interest, the system keeps functioning. But history has shown us what happens when trust disappears. In 2010, Greece fell into a severe debt crisis. Investors panicked, interest rates surged, and the European Central Bank and the IMF had to intervene. But the bailout conditions were harsh: tax increases, spending cuts, and extremely high unemployment. In Argentina, repeated defaults turned debt into a chronic national problem. In Sri Lanka, the government ran out of foreign currency to repay its loans, leading to fuel shortages and a political crisis. The moment the system collapses, creditors suddenly become visible. The IMF, credit rating agencies, bondholders with enormous influence over entire countries. Yet even after crises, the same cycle repeats. New loans replace old ones. Debts are restructured again and again. And eventually the system comes back to life. Because in the modern world, debt is not really designed to be paid off. It is designed to be renewed. Governments do not plan to eliminate their debts completely. Instead, they constantly refinance them. In other words, they issue new bonds to pay off old ones. Debt becomes, in effect, a permanent subscription. The real product is no longer the principal. It is the interest. Today the global economy largely depends on this flow. Like a fish that must keep swimming in order to breathe. The United States paying off its $45 trillion debt completely is almost impossible. Instead, it continually refinances it. Japan has been doing this for decades, and its debt has surpassed 250% of its GDP. Yet investors continue buying Japanese bonds. Because government bonds are considered the safest financial assets in the world. Pension funds hold them. Banks use them as collateral. Central banks treat them almost like money. In fact, the system depends on governments not fully repaying their debts. Because if they did, the financial system would lose its most reliable asset. Imagine the United States paying off its entire debt. Banks and investment funds around the world would lose their safest asset. The supply of dollars would shrink rapidly, potentially causing a severe economic contraction. Paradoxically, paying the debt could break the system. That is why governments continue issuing debt. But not recklessly. In a rhythmic and controlled way. Debt has become the heartbeat of modern capitalism. You can see that rhythm in every pension fund, every mortgage, and every financial market. That is why when politicians talk about eliminating national debt entirely, they are often selling an illusion. The goal is not to eliminate debt. The goal is to keep it sustainable. Because once the system loses trust in it, everything changes. Interest rates rise. Confidence falls. And an economy built on promises begins to shake. This is the real secret of sovereign debt. The plan was never to repay it completely. The plan was simply to make the world believe it would be repaid. This is a cycle of trust. As long as trust continues, the numbers can keep growing. But this trust is not distributed equally. When we say the world owes debt to itself, that is only partly true. Because interest payments are not distributed equally across society. Money usually flows from the bottom upward. From taxpayers and workers to the institutions and investors who hold the debt. In other words, debt is not only a transfer between countries. It is also a transfer between social classes. That is why global inequality and global debt often rise together. The system rewards those who own the debt. And pressures those who simply pay for it. Creditors are not evil people. Debtors are not victims. They are simply two sides of the same machine. The real question is this. What happens when the machine runs out of fuel? When new borrowing can no longer keep up with the promises already made. At that moment, the question, who is the creditor, stops being abstract. It becomes personal. At the top of this global financial pyramid, there is no single person to blame. Not China. Not Wall Street. Not the IMF. The truth is, all of them. And that includes us as well. The modern financial system has turned debt itself into money. Governments create debt. Banks multiply it. Investors trade it. And eventually citizens become dependent on it. The horizon line between debtor and creditor has almost disappeared. In the past, debt meant bondage. Today it means balance. But if that balance ever breaks, if trust collapses, and if the illusion disappears, then we will remember what debt truly is. A promise that cannot be kept forever.